Oh ja, we hadden het over. Nou, wie komt nog meer? Daan is in Israël. Daan Baruch is in Israël. Weet je, Bas is in Amerika. Joop Asher is ziek.
Maar ik heb begrepen het al heel.
Ja, maar hij is nog steeds in het tehuis. Dus, dus dat is het. Nou, oké. Wie hebben we nog meer? Nou, ik had gedacht, weet je, Nico.
Ja, Nico was gisteren een beetje doen, eventjes beneden.
Ja.
En hij was zo heel vroeg weer naar boven.
Ja, maar normaal belt u me op, ja, dat hij niet meekomt.
Ja.
Maar nu heeft hij natuurlijk gezien dat het hier is. Hij heeft ook een mail gestuurd. Ik denk, nou, maakt niet uit. Oké.
Okay, hello everyone. Hello, how are we doing?
Baruch
Good, Baruch Hashem, fine. Okay, let's learn. Let's carry on where we're learning about Shabbos. Let's go on to another malacha called Zoyreh. Not Zoyrea, not planting, Zoyreh. Zoyreh means winnowing. Now, I don't know, winnowing. I don't know exactly how to translate winnowing in Dutch. But the idea of winnowing is, we've spoken about this before, there are 3 malachas at least that talk about the separation of good parts, good entities, good parts of a product from the bad parts. We've previously spoken about dosh. Dosh, we said, is we've previously spoken about dosh. No, thank you. Dosh, I just had breakfast. Dosh.
It's kosher.
No.
Nee,
I
dat
was bij gasten last night.
Oh ja, verstaan?
Very nice. By Tom's in The Hague.
In The Hague, nice show, yeah.
No, the gasten wasn't in a show. They did it in some hall, palace in the city centre. You know, there's a lot of these places you can rent out. They're called Spanscherhof.
Listen, I've gone for 25 years there.
Yeah.
The group was also.
I was there in this.
Oh, not
in
the show.
No.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
It was very nice. So anyway, so there's different malachas that determine, that talk about separating good from bad. Dosh, which is the one we focused on for a long time, is threshing. Threshing, we said, is where the outer shell of the grain gets removed, gets released. Then we've also spoken, we've mentioned, although we've not actually covered it in depth, we will begin to cover it probably next time, but or maybe a little bit today. But the next malacha is another one of the malachas which separates good from bad is boire. Boire is the act of separation. And boire, technically speaking, I mean, we see instances of boire everywhere. We've spoken about this before. We see instances of boire when you have a pile of fruit on your table. Boire is separating off the bad from the good, or the good from the bad under certain conditions. That's what boira is. Now, there's another malacha in between dosh and boira. In the order of the malachas, dosh, threshing, is not followed by boira. Threshing is followed by zoyreh. Zoyreh is winnowing. Now, let's...
to the Dutch word because I didn't know it.
Winnowing, what is it?
Wannen is the Dutch word.
What?
Wannen, winnowing.
Wat is wannen?
Dat is winnowing, het is wannen in Dutch.
Ja, maar wat is wannen?
Ja, hallo. Dat doe je met een bam, dat is het zeven aan de koer van het kaf gescheiden. Dat doe je met een bam en een bam is een bam. En daarvan heb je hier een foto.
Oh ja, een soort zeep.
Een soort zeep, ja. This is in Dutch a bam, which I don't know if so good.
En waar je meel doorheen doet.
Nou, je gooit het op en dan gaat het kaf wordt van het koeren gescheiden.
It's what's this, like a kind of, what is it, a kind of sieve? What is
a kind
it?
of sieve, but we call it a wan, and wannen is the word. Wan is the noun.
Nooit van.
And yeah, never did I.
Yeah, no, but I'm actually not convinced. I look at this, I'm not sure it's what we're going to describe. Yeah, because there might be in English, there might be different. Let's do it like this. Rather than use a word,
it's separating.
It's an act of separating, but there are a number of acts of separating. So rather than use a specific word, let's describe the act instead.
Yeah, then
because the malachas cannot be easily translated. I've given examples of this before. Bishul, for example, is usually translated as cooking, but cooking in the halachic sense is broader in some instances and narrow in other instances than what we call cooking. In other words, bishul, in certain instances, the halacha determines that you can cook in a pot that's not on the fire. Normally, you wouldn't call that cooking, even though it could cook. You wouldn't normally say the act of cooking. People would normally say it's the act of putting something on a fire. In fact, cooking, the halacha says, can even be done in certain instances in a teacup, in a klisheni, in a second utensil. Also, cooking is narrower than what the halacha says, not just broader, because if something is below a certain temperature, for example, then we consider it not to be able to cook. If something properly cooks for a long time, it's in a klisheni, in certain instances, it doesn't cook. So if we can get stuck in the words and then we don't understand the quality, or the quantity, rather, the qualifications of a malacha.
It's simple cooking is that the temperature become higher.
In English, but not in the malacha.
Okay.
No matter if it's only 1 degree, it's in malacha, it's cooking.
Not necessarily, I'm afraid. If you take a pot full of water and you put it on the fire until it hits the temperature of yad soledet bo, which is, according to some opinions, 45 degrees, you haven't yet cooked, according to halacha. Both Torah and midrabanon. That means if you then remove it, well, midrabanon, you've done a forbidden act by placing it in the first place in a place where it could become cooked. That's a rabbinical prohibition to safeguard the malacha of cooking. But if you then remove the pot before it gets to 45 degrees, you've not cooked. You've not done the Torah prohibition of cooking on Shabbos. But the examples are numerous of where the act of
So they sell actually platters that just go to the temperature.
Right. Without any problems. The concept of cooking, for example, as another example of where cooking differs from where bishul, the malacha of bishul, differs from cooking, is a klisheni, a second utensil. Technically speaking, if you have a pot on the fire and you put from the pot onto the fire into a klisheni, into another utensil, another pot, halacha says that the moment it enters into that pot, it's not called cooking anymore. In other words, you can put the halacha talks about maybe there are certain things that cook in there, but generally speaking, let's say as a general idea, you can put milk into there and it doesn't cook the milk. Now, scientifically, yet it's not just scientifically, Tosfos already asks this question. Tosfos says, I don't understand. He says, what is the temperature of the liquid in the second cup, in the klisheni? If the temperature is 90 degrees, then why should it not cook? In other words, let's say there's only a 5-degree difference from the 100-degree boiling point that it was in the pot, and then you put it into a klisheni, into a second cup. Yes. And this klisheni might be huge, by the way. It could be an instance where the klisheni is really big. And if it's really big, the water will stay hot for quite some time. Maybe it's tall and narrow, so there's not much surface area. Maybe the walls are very thick, so it keeps the heat in. And all different instances of what a klisheni might be. And halacha says, Ein bishul b'klisheni. There's no cooking in a klisheni.
But if you say it's cooking at not at 90 degrees, but when you are in the mountains, it's cooking at 90 degrees.
What if you say?
When the pressure of air is less, the cooking.
No, it's a boiling down. It's what the boiling point lowers.
Boiling point.
So it goes down to like 90 degrees.
Right. But 90 degrees is above the temperature that the halacha determines cooks. Halacha says that you cannot put something, if you have a pot, for example, that was heated up, water on the fire, you take it off the fire, but you don't move the content into another pot. You then let it get down to 60 degrees, and then you put in an uncooked item into that thing, you've transgressed cooking. Because it doesn't need to be on the fire. In other words, the qualifications of the malacha of cooking are abstract. In the original pot, cooking takes place at anything from 45. The original pot means the pot that was heated by the fire or by the heat source. Cooking takes place anything from 45 degrees and up. But in the second utensil, cooking doesn't take place even when it's way above 45 degrees. And Tosfos remarks, how can that be? Is it if the definition, if the heat quality to cook is 45, is yad soledes, it's 45, 50, 60 degrees, whatever it is, then surely it should work even in the second utensil, in the klisheni. So Tosfos says a very unusual answer. He says the klisheni doth not have miskarerim, the walls doth noisov miskarerim, doth nausov miskarerim. The walls of the klisheni cool down the liquid. That's all Tosfos says.
Why you can make tea on Shabbos in cliché.
Right. Well, when we do bishul, we'll talk much more about what you can and can't do, because this is a general idea. In actual fact, there are certain things that we don't put into a klisheni and only in a klishlishi. But we'll talk all about that at another stage. Eventually, we'll get there. But the point is that Tosa says the walls call it down, and the commentary say, what does that mean? The walls call it down. Well, if they haven't yet called it down, then it's still hot. Klishlishi. If it hasn't yet.
You take it from this in this.
Yeah, that's klishlishi. But Tosa says the walls call it down. So the commentaries explain the contemporary authorities who elaborate much more detail than in previous generations. They want to try and suggest that cooking in the Torah sense has to have both the temperature but also the qualitative definition of a cooking utensil. And a cooking utensil is both the water's hot and the utensil's hot. But once the utensil isn't hot, then even if the water's going to stay hot for half an hour, hot enough to cook, it doesn't matter. It's not part of the general classification of cooking that the Torah forbids. In other words, the Torah doesn't technically purely forbid the act of the molecular change of molecular breakdown that takes place in cooking. The Torah defines cooking with an action. It doesn't need to be understood on a microscopic level, and that's not to suggest the Torah didn't understand that God doesn't know the reality. It's nothing to do with that. The reality is that we have to define the creative act of cooking, and we have to define how that creative act takes place. In what environment does the creative act take place? And the answer that the rabbis gave down, they handed down from Moshe, is that in certain utensils, it's considered the creative act of cooking, and in other instances, it's not considered the creative act of cooking.
And you don't look what's the real temperature.
And you don't look what's the real temperature. Well, you do to some degree.
You have a very good
thermos. It's a cliche. Exactly. Absolutely.
So next day when you
I have a question here because I heard a few times discussion about in a clean shishi you can put a tea bag, but I hear other people say yes, but if it's still at the 90-degree temperature, it's still considered an act of creation. And I don't know.
You don't think so, the water is 90 degrees creation.
No?
No, if you do it in the shlishi. You put it off in the cliche, and then you throw it in the shlishi. I don't think so, there's 90 degrees anymore.
Well, theoretically.
Again, ask again. Well, yeah. What were you saying? Yeah.
Putting water from
Cliche to the cliche.
And then a tea bag added to it.
Right.
Is that okay? Right.
It might
Because
be.
Yes, you see?
No. It might be. I only don't. We could talk about the official today. We don't need to answer. It might very well be. But if we go down into Bishop, I'd like to give over more clearly the sequence of how things work. There is a discussion about tea based on there are. I've said to you before. I said it very clearly. I wanted to be specific, even though we're not an official. There are general rules in the laws of cooking, like there are general rules in every melacha, and there's exceptions to the rules. The Mishnah tells us that although generally speaking, nothing cooks things don't cook already in a klisheni, but the Mishnah says that there were certain foods that were so quick to cook that even in a klishlishi they can cook. And the question is, what are those foods, and is there any equivalent nowadays? Now, the food that the Mishnah details, the Mishnah describes, is called kulias ha'ispomin, which means Spanish fish, Spanish kulias, which is probably a kind of fish. Yeah, some people say it's some kind of sardine or something. And what happened was they would take this fish, which was a small fish, and they would pickle it for a while. And then the pickling process would cure it, and basically it was already edible. But there was one concern. The concern was it was extremely salty. So what you would do is you would pour hot water down. You'd flush it with hot water, literally momentarily. You wouldn't even sit in the hot water to flush it. And because the flesh of the fish was already so cured, so the hot water would basically, as you can imagine, when something gets pickled, it does actually, the flesh changes. You pickle meat, it goes from being a bloody red to being more like the color of cooked meat. And then if you wash it down with hot water, especially if it's small enough that the hot water can get through quickly, then it can actually sort of do an act of cooking in a very, very, very quick instance. In other words, it does enough. It doesn't need to be cooked because it was already 99% edible, and it had a lot of salt. It's also highly cured, and it's small, and the combination of all those factors meant that when you pour water over it, then it instantly gets cooked. And the Mishnah says that cannot even be put in a kli shlishi, because although we said before there's something called cooking, generally the medium of cooking is the pot, is the kli rishon, the first part, but nonetheless, in certain instances, even a kli shlishi would be quick enough to cook something, but it has to be something that's small, thin, and very, very, very susceptible to cooking. So there came from there a big discussion about tea, because the Mishnah Berurah then says, well, maybe tea leaves, think about tea leaves, don't think specifically about tea bags, think about tea leaves. Maybe tea leaves are very quickly cooked because A, they're very thin, they're very small. If they've been dried a little bit, then they're like cured in that sense. They've been processed already in a way that makes them much quicker for the taste to spread, to transfuse through the liquid. And when you pour hot water over it, even in kli shlishi, the effect is immediate. You can see immediately the effect. So Shmuel wanted to say maybe tea can't be done in a kli shlishi. There were other commentators. Mishmur is not definitive about it. He just says it could have been a problem. It's not definitive. Others have said that no, that the effect that we see, Ramosha Feinstein suggests this. He says that the effect that we see in a teacup does not mean that there's cooking. Exactly like I mentioned before, cooking doesn't just mean when the water goes dark. The water might go dark if you put cold water in. It just takes a bit longer. Cold water also can spread the taste. The molecules start to dissolve in cold water, and things spread in cold water. And cold water is not cooking by definition. It's cold. It's not part of the malacha. It's not part of the activity of bishul. So Moshe Feinstein says, perhaps, he says, the way he doesn't say perhaps, he's quite clear about it. He said, no, I don't consider there to be a problem of bishul, of cooking in a kli shlishi, anything, including tea. And so there's a discussion about whether tea cooks in a kli shlishi or not. Is tea comparable to these products that the Mishnah mentions, which are small, highly cured, and easy to cook, or not? Others say, well, I personally did a bit of research, and our black teas are already baked. They're not baked in the traditional sense of baking, but they're heated to about 80 or 90 degrees for a few minutes in an air heater. And the idea is because tea leaves, as they grow on the tree, are not black. They're green, and they're soft, and they will eventually go moldy, as all plants do. Plants don't have a very long shelf life. So what we do with the tea is, and this makes perfect sense, and they already did it, A, they want to be able to extract the taste quicker, as we mentioned, and B, they want to be able to transport it around the world, and it will last. They heat it, they dry it, it's dried, and when it gets dried, then it becomes blacker, and as it's blacker, then also the act of drying opens up it starts to crack open the molecules, whatever it is, the various chemical components which allow the release of taste to happen quicker, which is why tea takes only a few minutes to cook in the cup, as opposed to if you had fresh tea leaves, it would take significantly longer. You'd have to boil them up. It's why when you see, for example, fresh herbs, mint leaves, for example, then if you put them into hot water, you have to let it sit for quite a while, or crack them a bit, break them a bit, to let the taste come out, whereas tea, you don't need to do that at all. Within 30 seconds of putting the tea bag in the water, the taste is all over the place. If you want a good brew, you have to get it right. The English will tell you that to get the tea perfect, you have to
boiling water onto the leaves.
Yeah, pour boiling water onto the leaves, but they say that it shouldn't be. It has to be 90 degrees, not 100 degrees.
It depends what kind of
It depends what kind of tea. Okay, so I'm not a monk. I'm not an expert, I'm afraid.
I ask you, as an Englishman, you like tea from a second cup, from a third cup?
I can't taste the difference.
What?
Can you? I can't taste the difference.
Uh,
Can you taste the difference?
Many years ago, we had a caller after we go, and he talked about tea, kli shlishi, and he said it's good, it's all right, it's okay, but as an Englishman in the country where people like very much tea and different tea, I don't like to drink tea. Shabbos, I don't drink tea.
My father has a cousin who was born in Holland, but she moved to England with her parents when she was like a few years old. and the tea here she couldn't drink.
Right. So that's in. No, so what I can tell you, I'm not such a tea expert. I like tea. I have tea every day. I prefer tea over coffee generally. But
you can
no.
drink tea.
Yeah, it was just I needed the coffee because I'm tired. But what I will tell you is that one thing is sure that not everything that's advertised as English tea on the boxes tastes anything like English tea.
Yeah.
And there is, it's not such a mumchiyut, it's not such an expertise because English tea goes with milk, and no other tea goes with milk. If it's a little bit too fruity, the taste of the tea, then it conflicts. It doesn't actually curdle the milk, but the acidic fruit taste doesn't have a good. Milk doesn't go with anything fruity. So if it's not right, you can taste it when you put the milk in. And if you don't drink tea with milk, you won't notice it as much because the taste is similar enough. But not everything that's advertised as English tea is anything like English tea. Believe it or not, trying out all the various brands, I'm not sure why this is the case, but the jumbo brand tea that says Engels and Melange on it, English breakfast, is somewhere closest, I find, to the English stuff. Because I've tried different things and sometimes it just doesn't taste right.
I'm you tell this because I always wonder why.
No, so
English.
Right, so this Pickwick one, this Pickwick original English is not as good as the.
Not as the jumbo?
No. If you like it with milk, again, it's nothing. It's not good or bad. If you like it with milk, this is a bit too fruity. I find. I haven't written a thesis on it, but it's just personal experience.
The point is in tea that you usually find what my cousin called glue, paper, and dust.
So it could be the tea bag that has.
So it's what is inside the tea bag because it's just a waste that left over when they burn, so they keep the dust, and that's what they put in tea bags.
In other words, the tea, not the bag itself, the same. The tea itself is
some of the during the process they got different qualities of tea, you could say. So the smaller pieces and what they call the dust, they're put into the bags because you can't just put them into.
Well, we have a whole show about tea.
Yeah.
Go
when I lived in Israel, the Koil used to learn. They used to bring a bag of dry tea leaves every day from the shuk from Machne Yehuda. Yeah, and it was delicious, but you couldn't put milk with it. It was a different kind of tea, completely different. You were going to say something.
Yes, it's exactly what I would tell you. That I always wonder why people drink tea with milk because it's a terrible taste
combination. It is if it's the wrong tea, absolutely. If it's Earl Grey or all these things, it doesn't work. So, for getting back to the way tea was processed, the reason why I mentioned this about the baking process in tea is because there is an opinion that says that even in the instance, and this is another whole discussion itself in the laws of Bishop, but even in the instance that certain things can cook in a kli shlishi, like we said, this Spanish fish, but if something, the Mishnah Berurah says definitively, that if something has previously been baked, then it cannot cook in a kli shlishi if it's previously been baked. Now, if it's true that the black tea has been at least exposed to heat enough to be considered baking, then tea anyway wouldn't be a problem nowadays in a kli shlishi for a different reason. Because although it's quick to exchange the taste, transfer taste into the water, but nonetheless it's already been baked, and we have a rule that technically ein bishul achafia, cooking doesn't take place after baking unless it's in a kli shlishi, when maybe there is a possibility of it happening. But in a kli shlishi, certainly not. You know, something that's been baked is considered cooked, and once it's cooked, you can't cook it again. It's been cooked. And there's a whole other discussion about whether you can or can't, whether there is or isn't a possibility of cooking after something has already been cooked. But definitely in a kli shlishi, the Mishnah Berurah says ein bishul achafia. If it's baked, it can't be. There is no problem of reheating it in neither in water. Obviously, you can't put it on the fire because that's rabbinically forbidden always, because it looks like cooking. That's a separate thing. That's a separate concern. So tea, in black tea, certainly has been exposed to temperatures that would bake it, at least what the halacha would consider baking. In which case, it's another added factor why Moshe Feinstein might be, at least in our contemporary scene, might be correct in suggesting that tea doesn't cook in a kli shlishi. I personally do make tea in a Kli Shlishi, but in England, the various Talmidim, the students of Rafalk, would get very upset with me because Rafalk says you can't put tea in a Kli Shlishi. He's adamant about it. But there are those who say you can and those who say you can't. Different opinions. But let
Only two possibilities. Normally, we have three different ideas about the same object.
there are more ideas. Trying to keep it straightforward. Or Hashulchan has a third idea. But yeah, there's always different ways of looking at things. But that's the beauty, isn't it? It's
doesn't
not
do anything to do with the temperature, because if you cook this Friday before Shabbos, it's full, and when you use it on Friday night, half of it, then Saturday morning, Shabbos morning,
It's a little bit.
it's total difference in temperature.
Yeah.
right.
Because of the
Yeah.
cold air that gets in concentrated.
So we have the problem now in Gerard Douwsel. The tourists come from Beit Chabad and they very brutal. They go to the kitchen, they take from the water, and when we have Kiddush,
It's not hot anymore?
the water is cold.
In the big Shabbos kettle.
No. It's cooked, and we don't have a Shabbos unless we expect very many people.
Yes.
But normally, someone goes to shul to cook 6 of these things,
Oh wow.
and we leave it for Shabbos morning,
And it stays warm.
and then
But if you get water out, you get cold air in, and that's what it goes.
But when they
Right.
get it out of at 9:30, and the Kiddush is at 12, then it's all right.
Yeah.
I think you have to have the Kiddush before davening.
Yeah, that is, we get coffee
Ja,
in
die toeristen worden steeds brutaler. Vroeger deden ze dat niet.
Wat?
Vroeger deden ze dat niet.
Nee,
Men zorgde ervoor dat je thuis wat had gehad of in het hotel waar ze waren. Maar nu verwachten ze dat het er is.
Okay, let's talk about.
That.
Let's go back to Zohar now. That was a lengthy introduction to why you can't translate a Malacha into English or Dutch. Zohar means winnowing, and winnowing, forget the word, winnowing is the act of separating the lighter shell that's already been broken from the wheat, from the grain, using the wind or the air. That's winnowing. Later, another malacha, a fourth malacha of separation is merakat, which is sieving, sifting. So you've actually got 4 malachas which separate. Dosh, which doesn't actually separate the mixture, but dosh threshes. That means that dosh is where we smash the kernels so that the outer shell breaks and the stalk breaks away, but you've got a big mixture. Then one would do zohar. So traditionally, zohar he would take a kind of big pitchfork, like a kind of a gardening fork, and he'd pull the big bundles into the air, and the lighter parts, the broken lighter stalks would fly away. And yeah,
This is the English Wikipedia page.
that's it. That's going to show everyone. It's wonderful. Yeah, that's winnowing. They're using the air. Rice winnowing. There's a good one. Winnowing in a village. Yeah, using the air to blow away. So they have like an open space, and then it helps if you live somewhere where there's wind, and you throw it in the air, and the stalks that are very light and the shell that's very light flies away. What's left is still a mixture of impurities, because sometimes what's left now still has, for example, stones in. It still has stones in or whatever. So he would still need to separate off more, which is the mloch boira. And even after that, you need to sieve it to get the really fine particles, especially if it's been crushed, it would be sieved to get the finer particles out and the thicker particles, the clumpy parts to stay behind. So there's a lot going on when it comes to separating good from bad. So Zohar is specifically using the air or whatever to separate off certain things. Now, you might say, well, that's all very nice, but when do we have any issues of Zohar nowadays? You know, in other words, unless you're a farmer, even farming, unless you're a farmer in India or in China, farming in the Western world, everything's done by machine nowadays. Nobody is throwing large amounts of grain in the air and letting the wind
Yeah, in small places.
in small places, right? But for the rest of us, does Zohar have any practical relevance in our world, in our general Shabbos environment? In other words, what is the definition of Zohar, and when might it apply? So there is an interesting discussion. There is a Biur Halacha in Hilchos Shabbos who quotes, if I'd remembered, I would have brought it with me, but unfortunately, because I wasn't in tune with the share, then I didn't remember. There is a Biur Halacha in Hilchos Shabbos who says that he brings from Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Rabbi Akiva Eiger wants to say that you cannot on Shabbos spit outside the window. That is what Rabbi Akiva Eiger says. He says you cannot spit outside the window because the air, the wind, will separate the spit. And the same thing would be pouring water out of a window. You live in a high window, you pour some water out. Forget that the ground below, let's assume there's no grass below or anything. You pour water out, it's windy. The wind starts to break apart the water and separate it. And so there's a suggestion that this is Zohar. It's winnowing, it's using the air to separate things. That was the suggestion. And the Biur Halacha is very, very disturbed by it. He's very concerned. Yeah, the Biur Halacha says that how can this possibly be Zohar? First of all, this. Well, let's try and understand it. First of all, the act of Zohar, the question we have to ask ourselves is it relevant only with natural products, things that grow from the ground, or is it true with other malachas? Now, again, here we see that from one malacha to the other, you can't make easy comparisons. Certain activities have nothing to do with only ground-based natural products. For example, boira, separation, which in the Mishkan would have been done as a follow-on to what we've just described. You're separating good parts from bad parts in a mixture of grain and shell, etc. Nonetheless, the tradition that we've received, the halacha tells us that boira is also possible. In other words, you would also transgress boira if you separate two non-natural things. So, for example, if you have a pile of clothes and you separate in a way that's not allowed, the good from the bad from the good, then you've transgressed boira on Shabbos. Clothing, well, technically they were once grown from the ground, but they are no longer considered organic products. And nonetheless, you've still transgressed boira. Equally, you've transgressed boira if you use toys. If you separate toys or knives and forks, cutlery, the Mishpura says, or Shulchan says, you've transgressed boira. So certain malachas don't need to be only land-based, only to do with organic products. But other malachas do. And the Biur Halacha says, the Mishpura says that Zohar can only be done with something organic that grows from the ground. There is no, when I say it can be done, I mean obviously that it's forbidden to be done. The possibility of the malacha only exists with organic products. There is no possibility of the malacha with anything that doesn't grow from the ground. So for a start, he says, water, spit, even urine, are not things that are relevant to the law of Zohar. That's number one. That's point number one. Number two is that even if you would say not like that, even if you would suggest that it may be also applicable with things that are not land-based, or not organic, which Rabbi Akiva Eiger seems to be suggesting, but he says, but the actual, the breakdown of what you're doing is not the same thing. In other words, you're in the act of Zohar, as we saw in the picture, you throw something into the air, and the air splits off wanted from unwanted material. Parts you do want from parts you don't want. Imagine that I get a cucumber. Let's forget Zohar for a second. Let's talk about boira. Boira also, he said, is an act of separation. Boreh. Imagine if I get a cucumber and I cut the cucumber up into pieces. Am I doing an act of boira, of separating on Shabbos? No, absolutely not. Why not? Because the act of separation doesn't mean, and again, here we get lost in words. Another example, it doesn't just mean to separate, because to separate in English means to make different. It's an act of sorting or separating good from bad. There's a defined concept of separation that's applicable only in certain circumstances, not in others. cutting the cucumber into two is not the act of boira. Boira requires a mixture of choosing,
Yeah.
separating, sorting,
Yeah.
but all these words have connotations. Sorting also has certain
But if you
connotations.
cut the cucumber just for meal, then it's.
But even if you don't do it, even if there's none of the rules or conditions of boira,
But you could even take a bite.
well, maybe you couldn't even take a bite, but either that, but
But about kartotheek, if you give an aliyah to people in shul, you choose
Cards,
the
cards.
cards,
Right.
the cards, and then no, I don't choose Mr. So you put it immediately back. But if you have it out and you after the
After
aliyahs,
Shabbos.
then you cannot set back in the alphabet.
sorting.
Huh?
Sorting, that's next. Sorting.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have a pile of cards and you want them now. There's parts that you want in this place and parts you want in that. That's an act of sorting. And that's problematic.
You cannot. So I learned not to put it back.
Yeah.
And then once in 4 weeks I went to shul to write down who had the aliyot, to send a rekening, and then I put it back.
That's
Now-
normally
now-
we did it
now-
also the same.
Now
After
I
Shabbos,
have,
we
I
wrote
have
down.
to learn it to someone else. They did
Yes, you
already
say we did
50.
it the same.
So what?
When we get to
it's
boil,
more-
we'll talk about
now
it.
it's more
We'll talk
complicated.
about it when we get next time. We'll do boil. We'll start boil. We'll talk about it. It's
It
all
becomes more
part
complicated.
of the wider question of boil. But if you have a
Same
cucumber,
with the worstjes voor Dalius.
Yeah, but nu hebben now we have
Use the
only
system.
10 men from ourselves and the rest are tourists.
right,
So it gets more complicated to
remember after Shabbos,
yeah.
you can't find them anymore. You can't track them down. They disappear without leaving a name. But cutting a cucumber in half is not an act of separating. So the same as with Zohar. It may be, says it ought to be, the Mishnah Berurah suggests that the act of Zohar is an act of taking the unwanted or wanted away from the wanted. Now, it's a mixture of particles, and the wind separates some from the other. But some of them were desired and some of them weren't desired. When you have water and you drop the water through the wind, you're just separating water from water. It's not one thing from another thing. It's neither intentional. You don't intend it to separate. It may be psik reisha, which means it's inevitable. And if it's inevitable, it would be problematic. But still, you have no interest in this particle there and this particle there. So the Mishnah Berurah definitively says he doesn't understand why there may be any issue of Zohar with regard to dropping water into the wind. But and that helps us to understand what Zohar is and what Zohar isn't. But, and having said that, the question then that opens up is, what about an aerosol can, a deodorant spray? Because with a deodorant spray, you do want that the nozzle distributes the particles separately. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
You hear the problem? So we looked like Zohar had no practical relevance nowadays in our homes, but what about an aerosol can? Because in the instance of the aerosol can, you distribute the particles. If there was a liquid or whatever it was, or even a gas in some instances, and distribute the particles, spreading them around. So you have a spray, you have all these things. Would they be problematic from regard with the point of view of Zohar? What do you think?
I don't think it's a problem because both come out and they are a part of it, but on the other side, you don't separate them because you want to separate them.
You do want to separate them because you don't want a thin stream of liquid. You want the liquid everywhere, so you want to separate things from one from the other. There's not good or bad, maybe.
It's impossible to separate them.
What you separate from what?
Let's say you have inside the bottle, there's a stream of liquid. Let's talk about a regular, forget an aerosol can, let's talk about a regular can. Yeah, a regular spray, like a cleaning spray. Yeah, kitchen spray.
Toilet spray.
Yeah, a kitchen spray. Something you clean surfaces.
You clean.
with. So when you press the spray, liquid comes up the pipe, and then the nozzle disperses. There's tiny holes in the nozzle, and it disperses the spray. So that instead of having a piece of spray go there, it goes across a wider surface. So you actually want to separate.
It's a micro gebeuren.
Ja, je houdt.
Huh?
Je spuit een gedeelte uit je flesje.
Ja.
En dat komt op een bepaalde plaats. Het is natuurlijk wel.
Maar wat deed je vroeger met die flessen spuitwater?
Ja,
Had je met die flessen spuitwater?
Ja, met zo'n ja, dat is een heel oud, ja. In onze tijd. Toen wij waren.
Flessen spuitwater.
En tegenwoordig mag je die flessen ook maken op Shabbos.
Ik heb het in 40 jaar gehad.
Nee, maar er is tegenwoordig is er weer wat nieuws. En die mag je gebruiken, mag je maken op Shabbos.
You have these bottles with lemonade. You can add the carbon to it, and it's allowed on the Shabbat.
Right.
And it has the same function, I think, because it's a concentration and it's dispersed through the liquid.
Okay, so what's the case of something dispersed? So Rafal says that at the end of the day, he says, even if you were to take on that these liquids are problematic, in other words, like Rabbi Kiva just said, that water might, because I said to you before, it might not be problematic, it might not be on the ground. But even if you take on that water is problematic, then if it's a water-based spray, it could be problematic. Were it not for a different exemption, and that exemption is that we said at the beginning that the Zohar is using the wind or the air to disperse the product, to disperse the particles. In the case of the aerosol can of the spray, you don't use air or wind to disperse it. There's a pressure, and the pressure shoots through the nozzle, which has small holes, and the effect is just to separate it. It's not being separated by air or wind. It's being separated by the holes in the nozzle. Just forcing something through some holes very quickly separates it. So Falk says that wouldn't be a problem. And there is a sefer, a grade sefer called the 39 Malachas. It's a 4-volume set in English. And he wants to say there that there's a difference between a spray can and an aerosol can, all these things, and the ladies' perfume bottles. Now, even the ladies' perfume bottles, it was very fashionable, maybe still some ladies have them, to have perfume spray, which had a little pouch, an air pouch. I don't know how much they're
You don't
manufactured today.
separate something, but it's only the same thing, and it's a pump to come out.
But and this is the problem, using the force of air, not pressure, but air, you know, the little air pouch, using air to push out the liquid. So there, Rabbi Rabbi, who writes 39 Malachas, says that would be different, even if it's true what we just said, that all these sprays are not problematic from a point of view of Zora, because you're not actually using air or wind to separate the particles. There's just small holes in the nozzle and the pressure builds up and sprays through the nozzle. But maybe, he says, the perfumes that have only specifically, not the ones that you have a push down button, like a regular spray or perfume, the ones that have this air pouch. So you're pumping, so the air pouch pumps, and it pushes with the force of air, it pushes over. Now, even then, Rafalk himself doesn't differentiate, doesn't say anything about these pouches. And I think the reason is, again, I don't think actually the air is what's separating the particles. I think the air is just creating the pressure. The air is pumping through the liquid and creating a pressure to get the liquid to come out of the bottle and through the nozzle. What separates the liquid again is actually the holes in the nozzle rather than the air. It's not being separated with the air. So even then, well, I don't know how many people have these squeezy perfumes anymore, but even in the case of these squeezy perfumes, Rafal doesn't seem to think there's an issue with them whatsoever. But again, the reason is because even though Zohar could, in theory, be applicable with liquid like water and liquid, organic liquids, let's call them, but nonetheless, if it's not the air itself that's separating the particles, but it's simply the pressure that builds up behind the nozzle, that isn't called Zohar. So we have a little bit of the basis of Zohar, and next time we'll do Boira.
I'll tell you next time. I just a moment. Take your.
My phone is in my
Oh, okay. Over there. So You could
So
take.
you have to go to Douglas and get it out.
Yeah. No, in old-fashioned times, women had they for perfumes, also like makeups and things. Yeah, on the dressing table. Yeah. In all in the various like English like spy movies.
Yeah, I think the last year from
Right. Yeah.
But nowadays you have these bottles with a thing on top that you
That
just
pumps
push
it.
down.
Yeah. It also doesn't. Yeah, exactly. I need to get
21.
my phone from. Where's my coat?
Over here.
Yeah.
Yeah. This the last shoe of the season, the season. Yeah, in 21 July, 25 Tammuz.
Yeah, should be fine.
Yeah, okay.
21st of July.
And then normally, I think so normally over there. Okay.
Okay, wonderful.
One
Looking
moment,
forward.
one moment. I have to.
in
No,
my-
doe. Oké. Wacht eventjes, 1 seconde.
Pick up some parcel from a neighbour from my old house. I accidentally got an Amazon parcel and clicked my old address. It got sent there after 10 days of not arriving. So where's the parcel? Looked on my orders. It showed it's been delivered there. So I went there, the lady, she